The Remedial Herstory Project is a nonprofit working to get women's history into the primary and secondary history curriculum. To help us meet our goal, we produce media, lesson plans, and so much more. You can check it out on our website, www.remedialherstory.com. Our project is funded through grants and by patrons, potentially like you.
Thank you to our patrons Jeff, Barbara, Christian, Kent, Jamie, Jenna, Nancy, Megan, Leah, Mark, Nicole, Anne, Sarah, Alicia, Katya, Michelle, Jessica, Laura, and Jackie.
If you would like to join these wonderful people and become a patron, you can head over to patreon.com and become a supporter of the Remedial Herstory Project. You too can help us reform education and allow women to be seen, heard, and complicated.
Hey, Kelsey.
Hey, Brooke.
Want to tell everyone what's happening in today's episode?
Today, we are going to be talking about early badass women in Islam.
Okay. Something I don't know a lot about.
Yeah. Get excited.
I am. Let's do this.
Hello, and welcome to Remedial Herstory, the other 50%, the podcast that explores what happened to the women in history class. Now, here's your host, Kelsey Brooke Eckert, and her partner in crime, Brooke Neva Sullivan.
In this episode, we are asking the question, what precedent is there for female Islamic leaders? And in order to answer this question, we are going to be looking at the early Islam, documents in the Quran, which is the holy text of Islam, things that are attributed to the Prophet Muhammad that he said about women and women's leadership.
Okay.
Also known as the hadith. That's the term for those things that are attributed to him, things he said. And it's a collection of works that are basically attributed to him in order to inform the precedent, right, that there is set for what role women can play in leadership. And joining us on this episode is Dr. Shahla Haeri, and I am so excited to have her. She is a professor of anthropology at Boston University. And
how exciting.
She's Iranian in her heritage, but has lived all over. And I am so grateful that she was able to join us. And she's going to be joining us not only for this episode, but also for the next episode.
Okay.
So pretty exciting stuff.
Yeah, this is awesome. I'm very excited to learn more.
So, Brooke, when I say Muhammad and the year 600-ish, where does your mind go?
Nowhere, to be honest. I have very limited knowledge other than a little bit of Judaism, but that's about it.
Yeah. Muhammad is the founder, the prophet of Islam. He grows up in in the Arabian Peninsula. Everyone on the peninsula are polytheistic. They worship many gods. And there are Christians and there are Jews that are around, and he has relatives that are Christian.
Okay.
But he has these revelations that come to him from God that are the foundation for the religion of Islam. And under him, Islam expands. There's a great video series for the educators out there and for people who don't know a lot about early Islam called Islam Empire of Faith. It's a really informative documentary series. You can find it on YouTube. It's really informative.
Let me go watch that. I'll come back.
Yeah.
Just talk
about the early years of Islam and about his life and the things that he experienced. He was pushed out of, his homeland because of his beliefs were so contrary.
Okay.
And then they end up taking that land back. One of the things that I have always found interesting, and we've talked about on a previous episode, is that the first convert to Islam is Khadija, his wife.
Oh yeah.
And she is...
I'm with you now.
Do you remember that?
Yes, that was a great episode.
Yeah. She's really interesting. And she's she's interesting on so many levels, but she's this very powerful woman. She is a business owner. She's wealthy. She's much older than he is. And she's basically the patron, right, of his vision and his work.
She spreads the word.
Yeah. And so I think one thing, when we're talking about women in leadership, it's hard to ignore the centrality of women's leadership in the early years of Islam. So what gets tricky and to sort of speed through Muhammad's life, when he passes away, the empire is growing. It's not really an empire yet. It's just a small, a region they control. And it's this turning point in Islam. And they have to decide who's going to succeed Muhammad. And where we're going to sort of start here is after he has died, and there are these arguments over succession. And he practices polygamy. He practices polygamy, and he has multiple wives. It's hard to wrap our modern minds around polygamy in this time because women just have so few rights, and being married is a way of having financial security, physical security. Right. And so a lot of times these marriages, it's not these are ways to protect these women, right? Especially widows and things like that. Yep. So, one of the marriages that he has is to a girl named Aisha. And she is young, really young when they initially married, but she's the daughter of Abu Bakr, who a lot of people felt, and Sunni Muslims felt should have been the successor to Muhammad. Okay. And so we're going to start with Aisha because she is so interesting. And she is an early female leader. She actually takes to battle against Muhammad's enemies. And, or rather not Muhammad's enemies, but the people she sees as contrary to what he would have wanted for the faith afterwards. She's also responsible for recording a lot of the sayings and lived experiences of Muhammad. And so she's an early scholar of Islam. So she's really interesting. And we're going to start this story with her, but having that sort of basic foundation of the turmoil post his death, I think is really important to understand what we're about to get into.
Yeah, very interesting. Do you know how many wives he ended up having?
I don't know how many, but I was.
And she was the second?
She was after Khadijah. He was very loyal to Khadijah, who was his first wife. Okay. After Khadijah, she's considered his favorite of the wives.
Okay, very interesting.
But I don't know how many wives he had. I'm sure that's knowable, but I just don't know that off the top of my head. Okay, so why don't we have Dr. Haeri introduce herself?
Hey.
Hello, everyone. My name is Shahla Haeri, and I'm a professor of anthropology at Boston University. I've been there for a long time. And my background is Persian, Iranian. I was born in Iran, then I came to America. I went to college here, got my PhD at UCLA. And I have been, as I said, a teacher, and I love being a teacher. I am from a large family, well-educated, upper middle class family from Iran. My parents were both educated, college degrees. My greater extended family also. My youngest sister actually is a professor at Johns Hopkins. I think if there is any art of telling stories I might have learned, I must say that's from my paternal grandmother, who was an extraordinary wife of an Ayatollah. And so I grew up in a very large extended family, and I'm still, in touch with them, many cousins. Happy to be here in Boston and feel of Boston as my second hometown.
Oh, that's amazing. And you were telling me before we started recording that you had been instrumental in helping Boston University have its first courses on Islam shortly after 9/11.
Not quite on Islam, but on Muslim women. I noticed that there was no course on Muslim women. And I didn't want to call it Islam and women, because it would give the impression as if both of them are one simple category. I wanted to convey the idea of the diversity and complexity of Islam's and diversity of the lives of Muslim women, their experiences in different countries. Iran is very different from Saudi Arabia. Even within Iran or Saudi Arabia, there are different classes. People live in rural areas, in urban areas. People are educated. People are from various classes. So I called my course Women from the Muslim World. So just to give the idea of diversity and complexity of the issue. And I was very happy to have it accepted. And since then, of course, many other courses are being taught on Islam and on Muslim women. But I'm happy to be the first person to initiate that course on women from the Muslim world.
Women seem instrumental in the stories that I know about the founding of Islam. It comes to mind like Khadija is the first convert to Islam, the wife of Muhammad, the first wife of Muhammad. And, it's like you learn these names, but then somewhere along the line, things change. And it almost seems like women in Islam, like women in lots of history, get overshadowed by, male contemporaries and political systems that are set up to not really be designed for them.
In fact, Khadija is so important, so influential in the life of Prophet Muhammad and then later on the expansion of Islam, is that she actually financed the whole endeavor. Yeah. And so long as Prophet Muhammad, and she suggested to him to marry her, she was presumably, according to the traditions, quite a few years older than him, but she offered to marry him, and he did. She was a widow, right? But she understood the significance of Muhammad's mission, and she supported it wholeheartedly. And so long as he was married to her, he never married again. So it's important to understand the women's contributions to his mission, to the Prophet Muhammad's mission.
So I'm really excited. I saw your book. It's called The Unforgettable Queens of Islam, Succession, Authority, Gender. And I couldn't help but want to read it immediately.
Glad to hear that.
So before we get too deep into the story of the Queen of Sheba, I wanted to back up and help our audience understand a little bit about sources of Islamic scholarship and sort of doctrine. And two of the big ones are the Quran and the Hadith. And I'm wondering if you could help differentiate these two sources for a less Muslim audience.
And as far as the Quran and Hadith are concerned, you're absolutely right. The Quran, of course, according to Muslims, is the revealed word of God to Prophet Muhammad. This is words of God revealed to Prophet Muhammad. So it is a revelation. And as far as Muslims are concerned, this is the highest source of authority for Muslims. Anything from the Quran is the absolute truth for Muslims. But then, as Islam expanded and conquered other cultures, other ethnicities, other groups, it needed to have a larger base for lawmaking, for tradition building, for rules and regulations. So what would be the most important source to go to? Is the Prophet Muhammad, is the messenger of Allah, is the messenger of God. So hadith or ahadith, which means the plurality of hadith, are the words, the deeds, the actions, the precedents of Prophet Muhammad, that they were collected into books known as hadith. But what is important to remember about hadith, which is the second source of authority for Muslims, is that it was collected many years after Muhammad's death, many decades after Muhammad's death. So for that matter, like 150 years after his death, there was sort of overabundance of hadith to the point that if Muhammad had lived 5 lifetimes, he could have done or said all that. So then there were scholars who set out to create rules to authenticate what Prophet Muhammad had said done and contributed, those were collected in authentic books, important for both Sunnis and Shiites. And another point to remember is that although the source is the same for both the Shiites and the Sunnis, but they both have their own corpus of authenticated hadith. There are differences hadith that one holds as more important than others, but many of them overlap. So the Quran is the highest source of authority. The hadith is the second source of authority for Muslims. But many of the rules and regulations in the Muslim countries at the moment are based or can be traced to the ahadith, to the hadith.
That's so helpful to understand. Now, the Quran is written down after Muhammad's life or during Muhammad's life?
The Quran was actually collected. That according to the tradition, Prophet Muhammad was not educated himself. So he would recite whatever revelations he had to several scribes, and they would write it down. And then after his death, the third caliph, Uthman, ordered all of them to be collected and organized in a book that we know it, the Quran. But what is important again to understand is that the Quran is not chronologically ordered. It is ordered from the longest to the shortest, or from the shortest to the longest surahs. Surahs are each chapter, right? There are 114 surahs. So the Quran is not chronological. It is based on the length, relatively speaking, on the length of the surahs. For that matter, many people misunderstand the relationships of some of the ideas or some of the rules and regulations proposed in the Quran. The Muslim exegetes and scholars have divided the Quran in terms of the message that it has into two periods. The Meccan periods, where Muhammad claimed prophecy, which lasted from 610 when he received revelations to 621. This is the Meccan period. And then he migrated, Hijrah, he migrated from Mecca to Medina in the company of some of his friends to Medina, where he died in 632. So those are known as Medinan revelations. There is a big difference in terms of the messages that are included in the Meccan traditions versus the Medinan traditions. The Meccan traditions, where he's inviting people to the new tradition and faith, it's more egalitarian, more tolerant, humanitarian, it's more inviting. Whereas by the time he gets to Medina, his leadership has become very prominent. Many people had joined his mission. So they needed more rules and regulations and more administrative regulations and bureaucracy. And that's what it is more included in the Medinan tradition. But now all of them are mixed together because the way the Quran was organized. Again, what's important to remember is that the Quran that was organized then and written down and collected, it's the same way, the same one that all Muslims take as the sacred.
Wow, that's so interesting. And I can't imagine too, like the historian in me is like the context totally changes when he leaves Mecca, right? So you're talking about the bureaucracy, but also they're kind of being attacked and pushed out and not accepted. And I feel like that would change my messaging, but I'm also not holy. So, there's that.
That's a great question, because imagine, Mecca was a tribal society. The most prominent tribe was Quraysh. And there were these clans, families within this larger tribe. So Muhammad was one of the Quraysh from the Hashemite clan. So you're being attacked by your own cousins and second cousins and, uncles and, aunts and all that. And in fact, many of the people who turned against him were his close families and friends. That's, it is really, by the time you come to talk about succession after Prophet Muhammad, we realize that it's a fight among the cousins. it's the Republic of the Cousins. Everybody wanted to be a caliph after Muhammad, and they all had the qualifications. I mean, many of them were quite qualified. But anyway, so I think it is important to realize that, yes, by the time he left the country, he left the Mecca, first of all, his paternal uncle who had raised him, was Ali's father, died in 619. Khadija, his wife, who was also very supportive, died in 619. So he was left without protection. That's why he had to flee the country. And it was then when he married. He married Aisha, who was the daughter of one of his companions who fled Mecca with him, Abu Bakr, and another woman. And then he went to Medina. And then people kept joining his new movement. And as you said, there was a change of the message, change of the behavior, change of the leadership. But nonetheless, he had this thing that came to be known as the Medinan Convention. I forgot the exact term for that, where he specifically said that all members of Medina, from whatever background, whatever religion, were part of this new community. So he accepted the diversity of the community and the differences in ethnicity. So that changed again, as we get closer to modern times.
So I think this is a good spot to talk about women's leadership, because your book is about queens. And we're talking about a faith that's founded by a man based on his revelations from God. But we can see already that we've got Khadija and we have Aisha, his second wife, the daughter of Abu Bakr. And it's interesting to me that one of the hadiths written years after Muhammad's life says, never shall succeed. A woman never shall succeed, in leading this faith in any governing sense. And I'm just curious why you think, you start your book with this hadith and how it has been an obstacle to women's leadership, not just in Muhammad's time, but presently in the Muslim world. And why do you think this particular one is so significant?
Okay, well, very important. The hadith basically says no nation will succeed or will be successful if they are led by a woman leader, right? So as I started reading, I realized that here we have the story of the Queen of Sheba in the Quran, which is the highest source of authority for Muslims, where a woman is a sovereign, a woman is a ruler, her people follow her. She's very wise, she's courageous, she's suing for peace. She's a peacemaker, caring leader, which I think should be a good, role model for any leader, regardless of the gender. And then, there's no specific objection to women's leadership and sovereignty and rulership in the Quran. Whereas if you come to the tradition, which is the second source of authority, all of a sudden you have this hadith, which is very important for Muslims. So the question is, where did this hadith come from? And under what conditions? And under what situations? And how did Muhammad himself, Prophet Muhammad himself, react to it? Or did he say it? Did he even say that? Because that is being objected. And in the Muslim tradition, the way hadith are being authenticated is that you trace the source or the chain of tradition or the chain of narrations all the way to Prophet Muhammad. If you don't have this direct link from whenever that hadith was said to the Prophet Muhammad, so that's a suspect hadith, right? So, or it's called as a singleton, meaning that it's one hadith and it can only be attributed to one person. So my point, what I tried to do in my book was to juxtapose the story of the Queen of Sheba in the most holy book for Muslims with the tradition that is the second source of authority and a source that is questioned. And in the intersection of these two sources of authority, first of all, argue the fact that there's no inherent opposition to women by the Prophet Muhammad. right? And also, this hadith was recalled many years after Muhammad's death, and also after a particular event that precipitated the remembrance of this hadith.
So you're doubtful of its legitimacy. Is that what
Yes. Okay. And I'm not the only one. Yes. That's in fact what I argued, that this is an alleged hadith, although I don't go into much detail about the arguments that many have put forward. Many of feminist scholars of women scholars of Islam, most significantly, one of the first people who did that was Fatima Mernissi, a Moroccan scholar who unfortunately passed away a few years ago. She goes into great detail about questioning the authenticity, the legitimacy of that hadith. I make a reference to it because that wasn't my point. The point was to say that if we juxtapose hadith to the Quran, according to Muslim traditions, anytime that hadith comes into contradictions with the Quran, the hadith should be let go. So why did this hadith not let go? Because so then I go through the historical events and the fact that many women came to be rulers and queens. So how did that happen? What was that other source of authority that enabled women to get into position of power?
So one of the queens mentioned in the Quran, I think the only one, is that correct? Mentioned in the Quran is the Queen of Sheba.
Right.
And she overlaps with Jewish sources. And so you have some good scholarship that claims that this person existed. She's not named, so she's the queen of this region with no name. And there's a lot of doubt that I'm learning online that she existed at all. And so I'm curious what you think about that. Is she myth? Is she history? Is she both? Where do you fall on this?
When you get outside of the main source, the Jewish Kings 1 and the Quran, then a lot of the narratives, the storytelling about the Queen of Sheba sort of gets mixed up between the Jews and the Muslims. Now, as to whether or not she was a historical figure or just a legendary figure, I think that I haven't really researched that, but that's my understanding of it. The fact that there are no historical evidence about someone doesn't mean that person or that even didn't exist. So it's just like thinking that whether or not there's any life outside of our, planet, whether there's any life in the galaxies. We don't know this huge amount. The fact that we don't know doesn't mean that something doesn't exist. So, but also I think, how is it possible, how extraordinary that we have in all these traditions, a woman, of course, these traditions borrowed from each other. That's understood. But nonetheless, they zeroed on the same thing: a courageous woman, a beautiful woman, a caring woman, a conscientious woman, someone who cared about her country's, her people's peace to the point that she goes through all these efforts to save her community, could not just be the figment of imaginations of some storytellers who happen to be most often men. So she must have existed something in a composite figure or singular figure. But then this story is so amazing. The history has been transcended into becoming the stuff of legend and myth. So she could be both a myth and a historical figure, but we cannot with certainty say that she didn't exist.
You start the story in your book of the Queen of Sheba by talking about Solomon. And I personally found this very interesting. I knew the story of Solomon because it was, built into the Bible and things that I had read growing up. But I thought it was so funny. I was like so empowered as a woman reading your book. I was like, yeah, tell me about the Queen of Sheba. And you're like, great, let's start with a man. And but I once I saw where you were going, I thought, oh, this is actually really interesting because so much of the story has to do with his sexual prowess. And I think that's an important piece of understanding the dynamic between him and the Queen of Sheba. So would you mind explaining this bit of the story to our audience and why you chose to start there?
Well, partly, as I said, the story was in the Quran. But then once you begin to read the story, you realize of course, any stories from such an important source can be read at different levels. And there are many layers to it. In the face of it, when you read the story, the Queen of Sheba, as I said, appears to be or comes across as this wise, caring, courageous leader. And then you get to Solomon, who is in all these traditions have been upheld as the symbol of most learned, wise, intellectual leader. You realize that he really just comes nowhere near her. He gets angry very quickly. The story in the Quran is very simple and it's actually not that long. The story begins by Solomon is reviewing his amazing army of beasts and birds, humans and jinns and demons. And then he doesn't see Hupu there. Hupu is his bird messenger, his spy bird. And he gets very angry. He just flies into rage. Where is this kid, this Hupu, this bird? If he doesn't show up immediately, I'm going to twist his neck, let him fry under the sun. So you wonder, why? Why does he get so angry so quickly? And both the Jewish and Muslim scholars and exegetes have tried to come up with some answer because there's no point for him to get so mad. Thankfully, Hupu appears soon and he says, look, I have come to acknowledge that you are not aware, because Solomon, according to all these traditions, could speak the language of birds and bees, understand all these languages. He was the king of the universe. And he was told that the wind would bring him all the knowledge in the world. So why was it he did not know anything about this woman? I mean, he might have heard about tons of other kings, but the woman ruler, I mean, it's amazing, right? He tells Hupu, just take this letter, go there, drop it to her, wait until you get the answer. These are in the Quran. So Hupu goes there, gives the letter to the Queen of Sheba, and the queen reads the letter. Smart as she is, she says, oh, this is a very important letter. She goes to her leaders, her advisors, and says, look, we've got this important letter. Advise me what to do. So she's seeking consultation. She's seeking advice from her people. Her advisors, who happen to be all men, turn back to her and they say, we are men of war. We are your subjects. You tell us, you're our leaders. You tell us what to do. We do whatever you want us to do, meaning that we're ready to go to war. Wise as she is, caring as she is, she says, no, we won't do that. Because when kings attack a village, people, they destroy many things and they destroy the lives of people. I will send him gifts. So here she is sending gifts. Now, the idea of gift is that you exchange. When you send gift, you're suing for peace. Just care. So she's hoping that it will keep him away from attacking her village or her garden. So she sends gift. No, we don't know what kind of gifts, but of course, in the traditions, you'll read a lot of stories about what kind of gift it was. But in the Quran, there's no mention of what kind of gifts they were. The gifts get to Solomon. Again, he throws temper tantrum. Me? What? To get this kind of gift? What God has given me is far better than what has given you. Take it back. Take it back. So he refuses. Not only that, he includes another letter that says, come, submit, or be destroyed. So when she gets this letter, she says, this is a very, very strong individual, leader. She embarks on a diplomatic mission herself. She goes to see him. Again, she doesn't say, okay, let's fight. She goes to see him again to save her people, her community, and her garden. So she goes there. And of course, there are again tons of stories about how that happens, but nothing in the Quran. she on her route to see Solomon, who has just recently refused to get her gift, now wants to have her throne. So he goes to his demons, to his birds, to his whatever, and he says, who can bring me that mighty throne? And one of the demons say, I can bring it to you before you get up from your chair. He says, no, that's not fast enough. A person who had the knowledge of the book refers to the Quran, Torah, and Bible. That person says, I can bring her mighty throne to you before a blink of an eye. And he does that. So now her throne is before Solomon. And again, just think, Muslims, a tradition, have disputed whether or not his taking her throne is legal. It's okay. It's morally right. I mean, that I won't get into that. That's an interesting tradition. But I'm trying to tell you how Solomon seemed to have acted impulsively rather than wisely as the queen was acting.
But yet he's the holy one, right? He is the one.
Yes, in the Quran and in the other traditions, exactly. But that's what I'm trying to tell you. So he orders his minions to disguise her throne. So when she comes to him, of course, some of these could be understood and interpreted metaphorically and symbolically. So when she's before him, he shows her the throne, and he says, "Is that yours?" And the queen thinks, "Oh my God, what is this thing doing here?" So she doesn't say yes, she doesn't say no. She says, "It seems as if the same, or it seems very similar." He thinks, okay, this woman is smart. He invites her to go to his palace. As she's about to cross the threshold of the palace, she sees this huge amount of water there. So she lifts up her skirt to go through the water, only to realize that it's not water, there are glass. And it was an illusion. So realizing the illusion, she reaches a new understanding, and she says, God, I have wronged myself. With Solomon, I submit to God, the true God. End of the story in the Quran. There's nothing about their love affair. There's nothing about their God, playing mediator or, intermediary for their marriage and all that. But of course, that story continues in the minds of the exegetes, both Jewish and Persian and Muslim tradition. One of the very interesting disputes among the Jews and Muslims, according to some traditions, is about the number of the wives that Solomon had. That's where the whole idea of sexuality comes in. Because, some people said, okay, what happened? The queen is there, the queen is at Solomon's palace, then he must have taken her. This is, it's the whole idea of realizing a new reality, gaining a new subjectivity, converting to a new faith becomes a sexual encounter. They say, well, did Solomon ever marry the Queen of Sheba? Well, we don't know about that, but then all kinds of stories. But the story is that Solomon had thousands of wives. Now, the debate among the Jews and the Muslims is that some say he had 700 wives, 300 concubines, and others say no, he had 300 wives, 700 concubines. So it's that kind of engagement. Of course, this is all in their tradition, not among the highest scholars. But it's interesting to see the character. Just if we were to interpret this story at a surface level, one level of interpretation, it tells you how caring, smart, courageous, understanding Queen of Sheba was, as opposed to King or Prophet Solomon.
Hey, Kelsey, I don't think our listeners know about the new upcoming project that we're working on.
Which one?
The video series.
Oh, the video series. That's awesome.
I know. So I thought we could tell them a little bit about what the project is, how it's funded, and what the purpose is.
Well, we are producing a video series, 25 episodes on U.S. history, 25 episodes on world history. And the point of these is to provide teachers who don't know women's history with like a 10-minute video that they could play for their class. So say you're teaching a lesson on the American Revolution. Here's 10 minutes about women in that time period.
Amazing.
And it could be a foundation that you can springboard from and do something really cool on those women.
And these videos are, yes, you, but they are fully scripted. You can look at the scripts. They're nicely edited with some really great content.
Yep. They're vetted by historians, 2 PhDs at least in history. So, people smarter than me.
But they're going to be free, and they're on YouTube.
And they'll be on YouTube. They also have a comedian from Hollywood who is helping to make them funny. So it's, because I'm like kind of boring.
No, very funny. But that's awesome. So they're really engaging and they're really cool content. So more to come there. So we have those coming out. And those are funded through grants? Through our patrons. Okay.
So their, contributions to us through Patreon are supporting that project. And then we also have a lot of people that have been donating through Instagram, Facebook. We have a Venmo account. You can find us there.
That's awesome.
And they're making those contributions. So yeah, it's an amazing thing. And if this is something that you're like, yes, that's what teachers need, every penny helps because it is a really expensive project. So
Totally. And we had a match donor for a while there too, which is really cool. So definitely if you're interested in those, feel free to donate. You can donate right on our website, Instagram, and Venmo.
Yeah.
Which is awesome. Great work. I'm excited to see the rest of those videos.
Oh, Brooke, thanks for your support of the project.
Awesome.
One thing I thought was interesting in this story was some interpretations that he wanted her to lift her skirt coming over the mirage to see her hairy legs. And it was an interesting, I was trying to put on a lot of hats to figure out what that symbolizes, what that represents from, trying to take away her femininity and show her hairy legs, to make fun, like mock her, or, and show that she's grotesque. And I'm curious what you think about that piece of, added on layers to the story that aren't necessarily in the Quran.
According to Salabi, when Solomon heard that the Queen of Sheba has embarked on a trip to go and see him, on a diplomatic mission to go and see him, she was in the company of hundreds and thousands of her people. Salabi says that, and this is 11th century, says that the king was sitting in his, throne, and he sees the sky is becoming darkened. And he asks, what's going on? Why is that? They say, oh, this is the cloud, the dust that has risen from the queen's army that is darkened the sky. So Solomon decides to show off. In the meantime, some of the jinn who worked for him had told him, because the jinns were worried that, because the jinns were put at the service of Solomon. Then when they heard that the Queen of Sheba was on her way to see Solomon, they became concerned that, well, she's so beautiful. If she gets here, Solomon sees her and he wants to marry her. And then the jinn continue to be part of that subservience to Solomon. So they tell him that her mother is a jinn. For that matter, her legs are hairy and she has the hoofs of a donkey. Now, you understand the whole idea of jinn here, parenthetically, before I finish the story, is that the jinns are shapeshifters, and that they can disappear and appear at will. They have the power. So if we think that the Queen of Sheba had her mother as a jinn princess, then she has this extraordinary power. No woman is supposed to have that kind of power. So it's not just the political power she has transcendental power. She has this supernatural power. So when the jinn tell this to Solomon, and he sees that amazing army coming towards his palace, there are a few things he does. But the major one is that he orders this pond or this pool of water made for him, underneath of which he had all kinds of fish and all that, and then covered by glass. The idea was to trick the Queen of Sheba to lift her skirt so that he can see whether or not he had hooves of a donkey and that her legs were hairy. And that happens. So when she comes and she tries to, according to the story, this is not in the Quran. So when she lifts up her skirt to wade through the water, Solomon, and there's a beautiful miniature, is staring at her legs, and he realizes that he doesn't have the hoofs of a donkey, but her leg is hairy. God forbid, this is horrible. Again, hair is a masculine symbol, right? So when that happens and she comes to his palace and converts, now he has her under her control. So he orders his demons and jinns to find a way of removing the hairy leg. Again, this whole thing is to emasculate her, to remove her power of authority and leadership, and to control her sexually. That's why this story is so prominent in all the traditions.
It's such an interesting story that's definitely told as a story, at least more than a history. But yet I think it's so interesting that you bring it up to start talking about real women who exist in Islam. And I can see how this story might influence the stories of these other women who are real and come later. Aisha, his second wife, is she second wife?
Yes, she's the second wife, but she's the youngest wife. And according to the tradition, she's the virgin wife, the only virgin.
So she is important. She's, after Khadijah, she's his favored wife. She is revered in so many different ways in Islam. Why is she so significant to both the religion as well as the early history of Islam?
Well, that's a very complicated story and can be looked at from many perspectives. But first of all, as you just mentioned, and we've talked about it, she was immediately after Khadijah. But unlike Khadijah, she was very, very young. And her age is disputed, and we won't get into that because it's irrelevant. To the story. But, and she was the daughter of Abu Bakr, who was one of his closest companions, right? She was a headstrong woman. She was very vivacious. She was very beautiful. She understood the social political capital she had. She was the daughter of Abu Bakr, married to the leader of the Muslim, the Nassan Muslim leader. And she took advantage of that. She had no problem speaking truth to power. And her vivacity and being very vivacious, she seemed to have brought a breath of fresh air to Muhammad's life because he had been married to a woman who was much older. He had several children. Some of them died. His son died. And, he seemed that he was, according to Fatima Manisi and others, apparently he was a very caring person. He loved to be around his wives. He marries quite a few number of wives. He had Jewish wives. He had Christian concubine, and that's a very famous one. Her name is also Mary. He was also married to a very important, charismatic, aristocratic woman, widow, who was only 30 years old, very beautiful also, Salama. So he had all these amazing women around him. And according to the tradition, he really enjoyed being among his wives, just sitting around and talking with them or visiting. Aisha particularly became important because, again, according to tradition, and just before I tell you, according to tradition, not only Abu Bakr's daughter was married, Prophet Muhammad, Umar, the second caliph's daughter, Hafsa, was also married to Prophet Muhammad. So Aisha and Hafsa were friends, and they tried to play, pranks and games in the household. But also Prophet Muhammad's daughters were married to the third caliph. Two of his daughters were married Usman, the third caliph, one after the death of the others, because according to Islamic tradition and laws, you cannot marry two sisters at the same time, even though men can have four wives simultaneously. So you can begin to see, these are a very interconnected community of cousins and kins. So Aisha was also, as I said, a very a courageous woman, not afraid of speaking truth to power. There are stories attributed to her confronting the third caliph, who tried to cut down the amount of salaries that each wife of Prophet Muhammad had after his death. And she supported some of the members in the community. So she was already a publicly vocal, visibly obvious leader of Islam. She had the convictions, the courage of her convictions. I mean, she didn't quite like Osman either because of things that happened. But by the time it got to the fourth caliph, that was Ali, who happened to be Prophet Muhammad's son-in-law and also Prophet Muhammad's cousin, then she was convinced that he is not the best person to lead the Muslim community. I told you the battle of succession among the Muslims right after the Prophet Muhammad was very intense, not only among his followers in Mecca, but also in Medina, among people who had supported him when he fled to that country. So there was a lot of tension among them. But the first three caliphs were supported quickly. But by the time it comes to the third, there are some people who are against the caliphate. And of course, the third caliph also gets assassinated. Second caliph gets assassinated. So by the time we get to Ali, who is from the same blood, like after Muhammad dies, there are two principles, more or less, we can think of succession. One is through the bloodline, the most prominent of whom was Ali. Another is more or less through the selection of the community or the political elite, which then that's happened. So these two principles of successions were constantly in tension with each other. So Aisha believes that one of her brothers-in-law was married. Two of these companions of Muhammad were also married to her sisters. She thinks they might be better leaders. So in their company, she declares war on Ali. Now, again, imagine a wife of a Prophet Muhammad declaring war on the reigning caliph, and she's being supported by a lot of people. She had these two companions of Muhammad turning against Ali, following Aisha. Huge number of people follow her. A war ensued, but Aisha lost. But Aisha herself appeared in the war. She was in the battle on her camel. That's why it is known as the Battle of the Camel, because the camel was surrounded by her followers, right? Then she lost. And if you lose a battle, then the victor writes the history. And but Ali treated her quite respectfully. And she became, she withdrew and she became a very well-liked sage. Initially, her contemporaries were quite excited about her, but gradually she lost the support as a vocal, visible, politically active woman. While the Sunnis tried to exonerate her participation in the war by putting the blame on her male companions and tried to elevate her again to the status that she had before. And she does, she's the wife, the mother of the believers in the Quran mentioned, like other Prophet Muhammad's wives. For the Shiites, because she went against Ali, then she's not a well-liked figure. In fact, you don't have any Shia woman who is ever called Aisha. But both Shias and Sunnis agree with the fact that women should not be visible politically, publicly, and should be shunned and stayed in the private domain.
In your book, you contrast Aisha's experience with Purando's experience. And she is not Muslim, although Persia will eventually be attacked by the Islamic Empire. But she is a woman. She is an empress ruling in a nearby kingdom. And I think it's appropriate and interesting that you made this comparison. Why did she strike you as such a appropriate one for looking at the story of Aisha and women in Islam, women leading in Islam in general? Because she's not Muslim, and so that it sort of strikes me as different and an interesting choice.
A very good point. See, there's a little history behind it. Apparently, when Prophet Muhammad sent emissaries to the countries around, the emerging and developing Islamic land, Muslim land, Arabia, he sent, this is according to some history books, he sent some emissaries to the royal court of Persian Empire, to Khosrow Parviz. These are the Sassanid dynasty, they were in power, and invites him to convert. And the story goes that the emperor just thinks this is audacious and it is outrageous. So he just throws the envoy out of the palace and says, go back, I mean, who are you to talk to us like that? But Khosrow Parviz is overthrown by his son, kills the father, and then he kills every single cousin and brothers and nephews that he had. And he himself became the emperor. So now imagine there's the palace coup and palace fight. And then there is this outsider army who is invading army, and there's much chaos that's going on in the country. Maybe the community wasn't very happy because there seems to have been huge class differences, and he has killed everybody. But he himself dies 6 or 7 months after he comes to power. Now, some say maybe by being poisoned or just some, natural diseases, he dies. No, he has killed every single male member of the family. So there is nobody to become the king. And remember, kingship is always being very important. The blood is very important. Succession, dynastic ties are important. The Persians believe that this divine attention, or they call it farrah izadi, the divine, I forgot exactly what the term for it is. So the kingdom, the kingship was very revered and sacred. So then the only person that could be elevated to the kingship or queenship was Purandukh. Actually, there were two sisters. One of them, they co-ruled one ruled before the others until it got to Purandukh. So Purandukh, despite the fact that the Arabs were the Muslim army was at the gates of her society, tried to create some changes in her society, reduce taxes, try to bring the dividing factions within her own countries together. And in fact, there is one victory that only she had against the Arabs. But anyways, nonetheless, she was killed by one of her own leaders and she died. Now, when Aisha lost the battle, and that alleged hadith later on was revealed, it wasn't said about Aisha. She was more important than they were referring to Purandukh. And they said, look over there. A country that leaves its affair, or a nation that leaves its affairs in the hands of a woman, never prospers. So it was this process of displacement from Aisha's actions to Purandukh's action, but using that as a way of keeping Muslim women in their homes, in the confinements of their homes, but also by analogy, displacement, referring to the Battle of the Camel. So I wanted to say that how many people are aware of the fact that had nothing to do with Aisha to begin with, but it was pulled out of the historical bag of some, imaginative scholar or guys, and just to use it opportunistically at a time to say that women are not supposed to. Look what happened to Iran. Look what happened to us here. So that was the whole idea.
That's so fascinating. So it's interesting that she dies in such a horrible way from someone who's supposed to be like protecting her. And I think it also I think many women today could probably resonate with this idea of when you are a woman doing something, you're under more scrutiny just because you're female doing that. And if you succeed, it's a yay for women. And if you fail, look, see, that's another reason why women shouldn't do that thing.
Right, correct. But also, perhaps intuitively, guys think that it's their right to be leaders. Who are the women? Both Purandukht and her sister Azamidukht, who also was the ruler, was the empress for a while, were killed by their own leaders. But Purandukht, her sister Azamidukht was more interesting because she was very beautiful and she was very powerful. One of her own leaders fell in love with her and wanted to marry her. She didn't want to. So she had him killed secretly, and then only for his son to kill her. But see, it's all political maneuvering and the whole idea of entitlement. In Iran at the time, Persian Empire, the idea was that not everybody could be a king. A king had to be related to the king, just like think what's happening in England. You have a process of succession. You have the blood. You have, like I am reading right now the story of Queen Victoria. It's just incredible. And all her uncles were such a nincompoops. They were all lecherous individuals. But they were the kings. So it's important to understand how these ideas of succession work and how men think, for the most part in most countries, that they are entitled to it. Just because they're men, their nature is better and different. God willed that. God wanted them to be the leader.
I really love starting our conversations about Islam by looking at the essentially precedent, right? Religious precedent that's set in these texts and in these stories and religious tradition that's passed down, because it doesn't take a genius to realize that that precedent influences women who come later, who try to step up. And so, when I think about the women in these stories you've told today, they either submit wholeheartedly to Solomon, or they lose in a battle and are sent home, or they are murdered. So it's sort of not a lot of great.
Their historicity is denied. Who knows? Because a lot of times, as you mentioned too, the history of women is not written. Doesn't mean that they didn't exist. It's just that men wrote about men's successes and victories.
It takes women like you to write the story that has been missing. So thank you. Your book, The Unforgettable Queens of Islam, Succession, Authority, and Gender. I found it on Amazon. Is there a preferred place you'd like to send other people to find it?
You could have my publisher mentioned. Because I think, but I have no idea whether they give any percentages, how much it is there.
Is there anything that you wanted to talk about in this episode before we ended that we didn't talk about?
I wanted just to emphasize the importance of Aisha, but she was not the only one, but she was the most public one. And she had, and I want to, when we see what's happening in Afghanistan or even partly in Iran or other Muslim countries, someone like Aisha walks to the mosque and talks to people. She is visible. She is vocal. She is courageous. And people accept her. There's an engagement with her. Whereas right now, some places in Pakistan don't allow women to go into a mosque. The Taliban behave as if women don't exist. So I want people to understand how things have changed, how the message of Islam, or the initial message of Islam, has been covered by layers of prejudice, patriarchy, entitlements, privilege, and just how the assumption is that women by nature are less than men, laws are against women. And then, of course, God has wanted to. No, God did not wish the women to be less than men. They are born of the same spirit, according to the Islamic tradition. So then why treat women as if they're disposable objects? So I want people to realize what it was and how these layers of prejudice later on completely blocked the understanding or subjectivity of Muslims. I mean, when I look at Taliban, I really just get extremely upset.
Same. And I would hope that invokes that reaction. They invoke that reaction from anyone. I think your book is so powerful. I think the story is so powerful. I'm really excited for educators to learn more, not only about women, but Islam at larger. And I think they will from this conversation that we've had. Thank you so much for sharing this information with everybody, for writing, for speaking truth to the Taliban and anybody else who wants to get in your way.
Islamic Republic of Iran too. Yeah. Right. Thank you very much. I enjoyed this conversation. I think you're very perceptive, and I really appreciate the fact that you've taken the interest in learning and knowing about the other. Thank you.
Oh, of course.
Thanks so much for listening to Remedial Herstory, the other 50%. Please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to your podcasts to bring more voices to the conversation. We really appreciate that effort. Until next time.